night exploded in a cacophony of screams and gunfire. Private Thomas Atkins dove for cover as a monstrous shape tore through the trench, its glowing red eyes burning with infernal hunger. Bullets ricocheted off its hide as if they were nothing more than pebbles. The beast's jaws snapped shut on a nearby soldier, cutting his cry for help brutally short. This was the Battle of Mons, August 1914. The Great War had barely begun, but already it had birthed horrors beyond imagination. As the British Expeditionary Force fought desperately against overwhelming German numbers, they found themselves facing not just the enemy across no man's land, but a nightmare that stalked the night, terrifying Hound of Mons. Little did these brave men know that their darkest hour would soon give rise to a miracle. For as the Hound brought hell to earth, heaven itself was about to answer their prayers. The Angels of Mons were coming, and the battlefield was about to become the stage for a clash between good and evil that would shake the very foundations of reality. But let us return to where it all began, in the mud and blood of the trenches. Private Thomas Atkins wiped the sweat from his brow, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. The trenches of Mons, hastily dug and poorly reinforced, offered little protection from the relentless German artillery. It was August 23, 1914, and the Great War had barely begun. Yet already it had revealed itself to be a beast of unprecedented horror.
Pass us the shovel, mate!
James's face was caked with mud and exhaustion. Atkins complied, his arms aching from hours of digging. The constant thud of shells landing nearby made conversation nearly impossible, but the silence between explosions was somehow worse. Hundreds of miles away, nestled deep in the foreboding Black Forest, a fortress-like structure loomed against the moonlit sky. This was no ordinary military installation. Here, in a secret laboratory buried beneath layers of stone and secrecy, Dr. Klaus Schmidt pursed his thin lips into a satisfied smile. The latest reports from the front had exceeded even his wildest expectations. The Hound of Mons project was not merely a success, it was a triumph of science and sorcery that would change the course of the war. Schmidt's eyes gleamed with a fervent light as he turned to his assistant.
Hans, prepare the subject for another treatment. We must ensure the transformation is permanent this time.
Hans nodded nervously, his gaze darting to the heavy iron door at the far end of the lab. Even through the thick metal, they could hear the creature's restless movements, its occasional growls sending shivers down their spines. The laboratory was a nightmarish fusion of cutting-edge science and arcane mysticism. Sleek surgical equipment stood beside altars adorned with eldritch symbols. The walls were covered in a maze of equations and occult diagrams, the mad scribblings of a mind that had pushed far beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge. Ancient tomes of forbidden lore shared shelf space with the latest medical journals. The air was thick with the acrid smell of chemicals and the cloying sweetness of incense, underlaid by a metallic tang that might have been blood. As Schmidt approached the cell, syringe in hand, the sounds from within grew more frantic. The thing that had once been a man thrashed against its restraints, eyes wild with a mixture of terror and inhuman hunger. Foam flecked its lips as it snapped at the air, powerful muscles straining against the reinforced straps.
Magnificent, isn't it? Once he was nothing more than a raving lunatic, lost in the depths of his own fractured mind. Now he is becoming a god of war.
The doctor placed his hand on the cell door, closing his eyes as he felt the vibrations of the creature's struggles.
Do you feel it, Hans? The power of the old gods coursing through him. We are creating something beyond human, beyond animal, a perfect predator.
Yes, Doctor, but can we control it?
Schmidt's smile turned cold, a hint of madness dancing in his eyes.
Control is for the weak, Hans. We do not seek to control. We harness its power, direct its fury. That is enough.
With practiced ease, Schmidt entered the cell. The creature's howls reached a fever pitch as the doctor approached, syringe raised. The glowing green liquid within pulsed with an otherworldly light.
Shh, my beautiful creation. This will only hurt for a moment.
As the needle plunged into the creature's neck, its screams transformed into a bone-chilling howl. Its body convulsed violently, muscles bulging and twisting beneath the skin, bones cracking and reshaping with sickening sounds. Hans watched in horrified fascination as the thing on the table began to change, its form shifting between man and beast in a grotesque dance. Over the following weeks, the Hound of Mons was subjected to a battery of experiments and rituals. Schmidt and his team pushed the boundaries of science and the occult, molding their creation into the perfect weapon. The creature learned to hunt, to kill, to obey the dark commands whispered by Schmidt and his coven of witches. The culmination of Schmidt's twisted vision came on a moonless night. In a candlelit chamber deep beneath the earth, the doctor performed his most audacious procedure yet. With surgical precision, he removed the brain of what had once been a man, still pulsing with hatred for England, and carefully transplanted it into the skull of a massive Siberian wolfhound. As the last suture was tied, Schmidt stepped back, arms raised in triumph.
Arise! Arise, Hellenhund, and bring terror to our enemies!
The beast's eyes snapped open, each a glowing ember of hellfire. With a shuddering groan, it rose on legs thicker than tree trunks, its monstrous head shaking violently, as if to banish the final remnants of humanity. It had grown, impossibly so. A guttural howl tore from its throat, a symphony of primal fury and ravenous hunger that echoed through the fortified compound, causing even the battle-hardened guards to tremble in terror. News from the front soon brought tales that chilled the blood of even the bravest men. British soldiers spoke in haunted whispers of a phantom beast that stalked the trenches, a demon with eyes of flame that moved like smoke through the night. Bodies were found torn asunder, throats ripped out, entrails scattered across the muddy ground. The Hound of Mons had become death incarnate, a nightmare made flesh that sowed terror deep in the hearts of the Allied forces. Schmidt and Hans pored over the reports with a mixture of pride and growing unease. Their creation was performing beyond their wildest dreams, yes, but with each passing day, it seemed to grow stronger, more cunning, and perhaps more willful. Over the next days, the British forces at Mons found themselves fighting a war on two fronts. By day, they faced the relentless German advance, outnumbered and outgunned. By night, they lived in terror of the monstrous hound that stalked no man's land, picking off soldiers one by one. Atkins had lost count of the men he'd seen fall, torn apart by artillery, or mauled by the beast they'd come to call the Hound of Mons. The trenches stank of blood, fear, and despair. It started with a sound, an eerie howl that echoed through the misty darkness of no man's land. The soldiers would freeze, hearts pounding, as the unearthly cry sent shivers down their spines. Those who had heard it before knew what it meant. The Hound of Mons was hunting. Private Atkins clutched his rifle tightly, his knuckles white with fear. He had seen the aftermath of the beast's attacks. Bodies shredded, throats slashed, entrails strewn about. The image of his comrades' mutilated corpses haunted his dreams, their faces twisted in eternal terror. The nights were the worst. The fog rolled in thick, cloaking the battlefield in a ghostly veil. Visibility was almost zero, and the silence was broken only by the occasional distant gunfire or the rustling of movement in the dark. Every sound, every shadow, became a potential threat.
Stay close, don't wander off!
Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. The soldiers jumped, their hearts racing as they strained to see through the fog. The scream was cut short, replaced by a gurgling noise and the unmistakable sound of flesh being torn.
It's out there! God help us, it's out there!
The beast's eyes snapped open, glowing with hellish fire. It rose on powerful legs, shaking its monstrous head as if to clear away the last vestiges of its human past. It had also grown much bigger, preternaturally big. When it howled, the sound was like nothing of this earth, a symphony of rage, hunger, and primal power that made even the hardened soldiers guarding the facility quake in their boots. Atkins peered over the edge of the trench, his breath visible in the cold night air. In the distance, he saw it. A hulking silhouette, moving with terrifying speed and agility. The Hound of Mons leapt onto an unsuspecting soldier, its jaws closing around his neck with a sickening crunch. The man's scream was cut short, replaced by the sound of ripping flesh.
Fire!
The soldiers opened fire, their bullets barely slowing the beast. It turned its glowing eyes toward them, a low growl rumbling from its throat. In that moment, Atkins knew they were facing something far beyond human comprehension, a nightmare brought to life. The Hound of Mons charged, its massive form crashing through the trench, scattering men like ragdolls. Atkins fired his rifle, the bullets striking the beast's thick hide with little effect. The monster lunged, its claws slashing through the air, and Atkins barely managed to dive out of the way. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, and saw the beast tearing into another soldier, its jaws snapping bone and sinew with brutal efficiency. The trench was chaos, men screaming and firing wildly, trying to fend off the unstoppable predator. As the night wore on, the Hound of Mons continued its rampage, leaving a trail of carnage in its wake. By dawn, the survivors were few, their faces pale with shock and exhaustion. The fog lifted, revealing the full extent of the devastation. Bodies torn apart, the ground soaked with blood. On August 26th, as dawn broke, the Germans launched their fiercest assault yet. Shells rained down on the British positions, turning the earth into a churning sea of mud and fire. As the barrage lifted, waves of German infantry charged forward, their bayonets glinting in the early morning light.
Fix bayonets!
Hawthorne's voice was barely audible over the din of battle. Atkins fumbled with his rifle, his hands shaking. He knew that this might be their last stand. As the Germans drew closer, a bone-chilling howl rose above the chaos of battle. The Hound of Mons had joined the fray, its massive form bounding between shell craters, tearing into British and German soldiers alike in its bloodlust. Atkins watched in horror as the beast leapt into a group of his fellow soldiers, its jaws closing around Private Wilson's throat. The young man's scream was cut short, replaced by a sickening crunch.
Fall back to the secondary trench!
But as Atkins turned to retreat, he realized with growing dread that they were surrounded. German soldiers poured in from all sides, while the Hound continued its rampage, an unstoppable force of nature. Private Thomas Atkins crouched in the mud-caked trench, his uniform drenched in sweat and blood, some his own, some belonging to the comrades who lay lifeless around him. The air rang with the cacophony of war, the thunder of artillery, the staccato of machine gun fire, and worst of all, the bone-chilling howl of the Hound of Mons. Through the haze of gun smoke and mist, Atkins could see the massive shape of the beast loping towards their position, its eyes glowing with hellish fire. Behind it, the German lines advanced relentlessly, their superior numbers threatening to overwhelm the battered British forces. This was it, Atkins realized with stark clarity. They were out of ammunition, out of men, out of miracles. Death approached on 4 legs and 100 jackboots. With trembling hands, Atkins reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered medal of St. George. It had been his grandfather's, passed down as a good luck charm. Fat lot of good it had done him here in this muddy hell. Yet, as the Hound's growl grew louder and the shouts of German soldiers filled the air, Atkins found himself clutching the medal tightly. His lips moved of their own accord, whispering words he hadn't uttered since he was a boy in Sunday school.
Almighty and eternal God, trusting in your great mercy, I beseech you, through the intercession of St. George, your faithful servant and courageous martyr, to protect me in this moment of peril.
The words came faster now, more desperate as the sound of heavy paws thudding against earth grew closer.
St. George, holy patron of England and protector of soldiers, hear my plea. In this hour of darkness, when all hope seems lost, I call upon your strength and valor.
Atkins' voice cracked, but he pressed on, the prayer flowing from some deep, forgotten part of his soul.
You who faced the dragon without fear, who stood firm in your faith against all odds, I implore you to stand with us now. Defend us against the evil that approaches, against the beast that hunts us, against the armies that seek our destruction.
Tears mingled with the grime on Atkins' face as he continued.
Grant us the courage to face our foes, the strength to endure this trial, and if it be God's will, deliver us from this hell. But if we are to fall this day, let us do so with honor, secure in the knowledge that our cause is just.
The hound's snarl was deafening now, the beast mere yards from their position. Atkins squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the metal so tightly it cut into his palm.
St. George, patron saint of England and soldiers! If you're up there, if you're listening, we could use a bloody miracle right about now. Please, we're not ready to die. Not here, not like this. Help us, fight with us, for England, for all of us, please!
Atkins' voice trailed off on the last word. He braced himself, waiting for the inevitability of teeth and claws, of bayonets and bullets. Instead, there was silence, the constant barrage of noise that had formed the backdrop of Atkins' existence for days simply stopped. No gunfire, no screams, no bestial howls. Nothing but an eerie, pregnant quiet. Atkins opened his eyes. The world had changed. A blinding light split the sky, so bright it turned night to day. Atkins threw up his arm, squinting against the radiance that outshone even the muzzle flashes of artillery. As his vision slowly adjusted, he lowered his arm, and his jaw dropped in awe. Descending from the rift in the heavens were figures that defied explanation. Radiant beings of pure white, their forms suffused with an ethereal glow. Great wings spread from their backs, and halos of light crowned their heads. They moved with fluid grace, their feet never quite touching the blood-soaked earth, as they formed a line between the British forces and their attackers. At the center of this celestial host stood a figure larger and more prominent than the rest. Atkins recognized him instantly from 100 stained glass windows and faded paintings. Astride a magnificent white charger, his armor shining like the sun, lance at the ready, was St. George himself.
Bloody hell! It worked! It actually worked!
Atkins could only nod mutely, his mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. His desperate prayer, born of terror and hopelessness, had been answered in the most spectacular way imaginable. St. George raised his lance, pointing it directly at the Hound of Mons. When he spoke, his voice resonated with the power of 1,000 trumpets shaking the very ground beneath their feet.
Abomination, your reign of terror ends now!
The German advance stuttered, men gaping in awe or scrambling backward in terror. Even the Hound of Mons, that engine of destruction that had torn through their lines with impunity, faltered. It snarled, hackles raised, but there was a new note in its growl. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. As the hound gathered itself to spring, the angelic host sprang into action. They positioned themselves in a perfect defensive formation, creating an impenetrable barrier between the British forces and their attackers. The air hummed with energy as boughs of pure light materialized in their hands.
Fire!
St. George's voice rolled like thunder across the battlefield. A volley of radiant arrows arced through the night sky, leaving trails of celestial fire in their wake. Where they struck, German soldiers fell, their faces masks of confusion and terror. The supernatural projectiles seemed to pass through flesh and armor alike, leaving no visible wounds, but dropping men where they stood. The hound, momentarily forgotten in the chaos, lunged at St. George with hellfire blazing in its eyes. But the saint was ready. His lance flashed, leaving a trail of searing light as it cleaved the air. The hound yelped, a sound of pain and fury, as an angry red gash appeared on its flank. Enraged, the beast snapped and snarled, its massive form a blur of motion as it fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. St. George wheeled his charger with impossible grace, his sword now in hand, trading blow for blow with the monstrous creature. Around them, the battle had been renewed with supernatural fury. The angelic archers continued their assault, their arrows causing panic and disarray in the German lines. Those enemy soldiers who tried to stand their ground found their bullets passing harmlessly through the spectral warriors. Atkins watched in stunned amazement as a group of angels swept low over a machine gun nest. The gunners' screams were cut short as they were lifted bodily into the air and hurled back towards their own lines. The tide of battle had turned, but the outcome still hung in the balance. The Hound, for all its wounds, was still a force of nature. It lashed out with razor-sharp claws, catching St. George's armor and leaving deep furrows. The two titans grappled, a whirlwind of fur, fang, and divine light. St. George, his armor now dented and streaked with dark blood, raised his sword high. Light gathered at the tip, building to an intensity that hurt to look at directly.
Turn to the abyss!
The saint's roar shook the very foundations of the earth. The sword came down in a final, devastating blow. There was a sound like reality itself being torn asunder, and a shockwave of pure force knocked Atkins and his fellow soldiers off their feet. When the dust settled, the Hound of Mons was gone. Where it had stood was nothing but a smoking crater and the lingering scent of brimstone. The angelic host turned as one, their attention now fully on the retreating Germans. Terror broke the enemy lines as men fled before the wrath of heaven itself. As swiftly as they had appeared, the angels began to fade. The last to leave was St. George, who turned to survey the awestruck British soldiers.
Take heart, for even in the darkest night, hope endures.
With that, they were gone, leaving behind a battlefield bathed in an unnatural calm. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. The only sound the distant rumble of artillery and the groans of the wounded. Lieutenant Hawthorne was the first to shake off the stupor. His voice was shaky but determined.
Right, lads! I don't know what in God's name just happened, but we've been given a chance! Let's not waste it! Gather the wounded and fall back to our secondary positions!
As Atkins helped his dazed comrades retreat, his mind reeled. The horrors of the Hound had been real, a nightmare of man's creation brought to terrifying life. But St. George and his angels, they were something else entirely. A reminder that even in war's darkest hour, light could pierce the shadows. The Battle of Mons was far from over, and the war would rage on for years to come. But on that day, in that muddy field in Belgium, Atkins and his fellow soldiers had witnessed something beyond the realm of mortal understanding. It was an experience that would stay with them long after the guns fell silent. A moment when the veil between worlds had lifted, and heaven itself had joined the fray. As we close this chapter, we're left pondering the profound questions it raises. Were the spectral archers truly divine beings? A celestial response to humanity's darkest hour? Was the Hound of Mons a manifestation of war's horrors, a demonic entity, or something even more ancient and sinister? Could these forces still exist, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to reveal themselves? At DeadNet Studios, we believe in the power of stories to challenge our understanding and ignite our curiosity. Join our community of truth seekers by subscribing and engaging with us. Your thoughts and experiences could be the key to unlocking these mysteries. Have you encountered something unexplained? Something that defies rational explanation? Share your story with us in the comments. Your experience could be a piece of a larger puzzle, a clue that leads us closer to the truth. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking answers. The next revelation could be just around the corner, waiting for those who dare to illuminate the darkness. And now, here's a sneak peek at what's coming up next week. Panama isn't just about tropical beaches and the famous canal. It's also home to some seriously weird creatures that people swear they've seen. We're talking about cryptids, animals that science says don't exist, but locals insist are real. From a tiny goblin dodging cars in the city to a ghost woman who can grow as tall as a skyscraper, Panama's got it all. And these aren't just old stories your grandma tells you. People are still reporting sightings today with videos and witnesses to back them up. We're going to dive into 10 of Panama's most infamous cryptids: El Duende, La Tulivieja, the Panama Creature, La Silampa, El Coco, El Cadejo, Huaychivo, Las Brujas, Mapinguari, and the Chupacabra. Each one has a wild story behind it, and some recent encounters that'll make you wonder what's really out there in Panama's jungles and mountains. So buckle up. We're about to explore a side of Panama that your average tourist guide won't tell you about.
In the shadows of the digital night, we wandered far.